From the patient files of Dr. William Wickman, director of Hillbrook Insane Asylum. Patient number 876, Jordan Page, aka Porcelain-Face. Patient suffers from delusions, obsessive behavior, and occasional violent outbursts. White female, age 27, brown hair, brown eyes, 5.8 feet tall, 142 pounds. For the last 8 weeks, I've worked on a new, somewhat radical treatment method with patient 876. I have neglected to make recordings of these sessions, waiting until the treatment was finished, and then making a single recording, compiling all sessions together, presenting my results. And here we are. The treatment is finished, I would say. Was it successful? Well, we'll get to that. So, first a little background for those among the staff not familiar with patient 876, although I can't imagine anyone not knowing the story of Jordan Page, in this asylum or anywhere else in the world. She is, after all, one of our most famous patients. Patient 876 is a genuine celebrity, a former glamour model. She was the one half of a twin-sister model duo. It was her and her identical twin, Lee Page. The duo used to be highly successful and popular. That is, until their car accident. They were driving home in their expensive sports car after a night of partying. Lots of alcohol had been consumed, which resulted in the twins ramming their expensive sports car right into another car. Long story short, Jordan's gorgeous face was completely destroyed in the accident, while Lee walked away unscathed. Despite extensive surgery, Jordan's face was not able to be restored. Ironically, the beautiful model now had to live out the rest of her life disfigured. Her career was of course ruined, and so was apparently her sanity too. Jordan must have snapped from the trauma of losing her face. She began to wear a mask, a porcelain mask sculpted and painted to look like her old face. This is the same mask she still wears to this day and refuses to take off. The patient will in fact react violently if attempts to remove it are made. Anyway, Jordan secluded herself in her and Lee's mansion. Her mental state deteriorated. Eventually, one day, she kidnapped her plastic surgeon and Lee. She then forced the surgeon into performing an operation on her sister, namely removing her face. The idea was to transplant the face onto Jordan, thus giving back her old beautiful face. This operation was never completed, as the surgeon was able to overpower Jordan and call the police. It's been about a year since she arrived here at Hillbrook. Patient 876 is a bit of a mystery. She had no history of mental illness whatsoever, not even any known substance abuse, which is so common with celebrities. At the most, it seems like the patient occasionally had a few too many drinks. Now, why would a person with zero mental issues or substance abuse issues suddenly go completely insane? Change her entire personality. Just from watching old footage of her and her sister, 876 obviously comes off as incredibly social, energetic, and charming. Now she will barely even speak, and has disappeared into what appears to be a fantasy world. The only conclusion I can draw is an extreme case of post-traumatic stress disorder. 876 was so traumatized by losing her face that it fundamentally changed her as a person. I do have a theory though, a way this radical change could have been prevented. And that is, if she had been separated from her sister. She should never have gone back to living with her sister in their mansion. Her sister's face was a constant reminder of what she had lost after all. That is what truly drove her to insanity, slowly over time. It is the Page face she's obsessed with after all, not any random pretty face. Working from this theory, I was thus able to come up with an appropriate form of therapy. The only way to cure patient 876 is to get her to move on from what she used to look like. Break all ties to the beautiful page face and accept what she looks like now. I began this therapy 8 weeks ago, and these are my results. We begin with session 40. I have to read my notes here as some of these sessions took place quite a while ago. Let's see now. The patient was seated, wearing her straitjacket, of course. She stared into empty space, neither moving nor talking. I entered the session room. She paid me no attention whatsoever. It was as if I wasn't even there. I had a guard in there with me as well, just for safety's sake, due to this new form of therapy I had planned. I could see the patient's eyes behind that uncanny porcelain mask. They were big and wide, fixed on something that was invisible to me and the guard. I had with me the patient's folder as usual and placed it on the table, my notepad as well. I had an additional folder with me, this one not containing files on the patient, but magazines. This was part of the therapy. I placed this folder on the table as well and opened it up. I looked down at the magazines it contained. The beautiful faces of 2 Jordan pages stared back up at me. It was an issue of Vogue, featuring Jordan and Lee Page on the cover. I picked it up. Underneath it was a Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition, with the Page twins in bikinis on the cover. I held the Vogue issue up before the patient. That immediately caught her attention. She ripped her gaze away from whatever it was she was staring at and looked at the cover. As if possible, her eyes grew even wider. The guard positioned himself behind her, ready to grab a hold of her if she made a sudden move. Patient 876 isn't very strong, so one guard is more than enough to subdue her. From my jacket pocket, I produced a pair of scissors. The patient stared at them, presumably wondering what I was going to do with them. I then did what I assume she feared I would. I began to cut straight through the middle of the magazine, cutting the cover in half. Once that was done, I proceeded to cut the remaining pieces in half, completely destroying the beautiful image of the Page twins. I did all of this right before the patient, so that she could see every gruesome detail. The deletion of her former self. She had to let it go. It was over and wasn't coming back. The patient shook in her chair. She strained against the straitjacket. She emitted a peculiar moaning sound, a sound of anxiety. Just as I was cutting the final piece, she made a jump for me, leaping over the table. But before she could get very far, the guard grabbed her by the neck and easily held her in place. He held her in a grip for a few minutes as she screamed and kicked, until she finally calmed down. I then left, and the patient was taken back to her cell. End of session 40, the first step of this new therapy. It went about as I suspected it would. We now move on to session 41. Same procedure as last time. This time it was a Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition that fell prey to my pair of scissors. I got the exact same reaction out of the patient. She lunged at me as I obliterated the memory of the former Jordan Page. Again, the guard caught her and held her down. I had expected this, though. The therapy would take time. I was prepared for that. Progress always takes time. Session 42. Same procedure. An issue of Playboy was chosen, featuring one of the few nude shoots the twins had made. With my pair of scissors, I made sure it didn't exist any longer, though. This time around, the patient did not freak out. She stared at me with wide, frantic eyes as I vandalized the arousing image, but she never made a move. She didn't shake, twitch, or jump at me. She just sat there. She didn't like what I was doing, but nevertheless, it was progress. This result fueled me with confidence that my method was working. Session 43. I was very anxious to get this session started and see what would happen. Again, same procedure. An issue of Maxime was chosen, the one where the Page twins were voted the hottest woman in the world. The only time in the magazine's history that title has been given to two women at the same time. I tore it up, of course, right before her very eyes. This time, the patient barely paid me any attention. She glanced over at my actions a few times, but for most of the session, she simply stared off into empty space, indifferent. This was exactly the result I was hoping for. I was ecstatic. Patient 876 not only barely responded to images of her former self, but didn't even mind the desecration of them. She was ready to move on to the next step. Thus, with session 44, we began phase 2 of our therapy. Phase 2 did not require the magazines any longer. For this phase, I had contacted the artist who made the patient's mask. I had asked if he could create more masks, specifically for use in our therapy. This he gladly did, for free even, as he'd do anything to help 876. He used to be very close with his sisters after all. He produced a full dozen more identical masks and delivered them to us himself even. Despite her actions and current mental state, patient 876 still has plenty of friends. Anyway, I entered the session room, unbeknownst to 876, carrying with me one of the masks in a bag. The patient was quite surprised when I pulled the mask out and showed it to her. She did not get anxious or upset though, but merely curious. I placed the mask on the table before her. She looked at it with confusion. What was her face doing on the table? I then pulled out a hammer from the bag and swung down at the mask, smashing it into 1,000 pieces. The patient was startled and jumped back in her chair. She looked up at me, baffled. She almost seemed a bit scared too. The session was over. Very interesting results. I had actually expected a violent outburst. Session 45. For this session, the patient would not wear a straitjacket. I know, it's against regulations. Violent or potentially violent patients must always wear straitjackets during therapy sessions. But for this form of therapy, she needed her hands free. The session started off as last time. I placed a mask on the table and smashed it to bits before the patient. However, I then pulled up another mask and placed it on the table. With hammer in hand, I then moved up behind the patient. Moving in close to her, I placed the hammer in the patient's hand, while still grabbing it myself. I then raised her and my arm in unison, and then swung down at the mask. Together we destroyed it. The patient remained baffled throughout. I was just glad she wasn't resisting. Before moving on to the next step though, we had to repeat this one, just to be sure. So session 46 was basically just a repetition of session 45. It was then time for session 47, which took place earlier today. Not even an hour ago, in fact. I began the session by smashing a mask before the patient myself. I then placed another mask on the table. Instead of moving up close to her and swinging the hammer together, this time I simply placed the hammer in her hand and moved away. Yes. I can just hear Dr. Quartermain freaking out already. I know, giving a hammer to a patient is not a very good idea. But I had to. In order for the therapy to work, she had to destroy a mask on her own. She had to do it of her own free will. So what happened is, she swung the hammer all right, but not at the mask. At me. Yeah. Luckily she missed though, and the guard quickly subdued her. Now if this step had been a success, the next step would have been to have her remove her own mask and smash that one with the hammer. Thus, she would have been cured of her obsession with her old face, and she would have been able to move on. As it stands though, the entire treatment appears to be a complete failure, and patient 876 doesn't seem to have learned a thing. I guess it's back to the drawing board. God damn it. End recording.